Hello, everybody, and welcome to the FCC Next Steps podcast. This is an opportunity where we, as a staff at FCC, can bring a little extra discipleship content to you throughout the week that doesn't necessarily fit on a Sunday morning context. My name is Jordan. I'm the lead pastor at First Christian. If we haven't met before, we're glad you could join us. This is session 6, in a series where we've been looking at Genesis chapter 1. Just kind of doing a more deep dive academic study of the creation story. And so far, we've been able to look at the ancient context of the story, how it takes place in not just the geographic location, but the cultural setting of what we call the ancient Near East, and how it reflects a lot of the expectations of that ancient culture, and draws from some of the literary expectations and cultural concepts that were very prevalent throughout civilizations in that ancient area. Today, we're going to continue that by looking at what we call the filling days of the creation story. These are going to be days 4 through 6, specifically Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 25. And we call them filling days because, as we saw back in verse 2, there were two main problems plaguing the primordial creation. It was formless and it was empty. And we saw in the first 3 days that God gave form to the formlessness, and he separated light from dark. He separated waters above from waters below. He separated the waters from the dry land and covered the land in vegetation. And so the world has been formed, and the only remaining problem now is this issue of being empty. And so that's what these days will seek to remedy. And the filling days correspond with a specific forming day. So, like, we're going to look at day 4, and it corresponds with day 1. On day 1, the light and dark were separated. Here we're going to see on day 4 that there are heavenly bodies made to fill the light and the dark. Same thing with day 2, with the separations of waters above and below. On day 2, we're going to see the formation of marine life to fill the waters below, and avian life to fill the expanse, the sky. And then finally, day 3, where the dry land was formed, or the dry land was separated from the water, rather, we're going to see that the dry land is filled with living creatures, and so on. And so there's very much a structure to this story, which, and I believe we said this in a previous session, but even the way this story is told with its structure undergirds one of the foundational messages that God is creating a good, ordered, functional creation. And so I just think that's a really cool thing to point out as we go into this. Sort of on a meta level, this story teaches and reinforces its main points. So let's get into the text. I've rambled enough. So we're going to start in chapter 1, verse 14. It says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky." Sorry, let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. So you can see how light and dark were separated on day 1, and we mentioned this in a previous session, they existed without a light source. Like, light and dark were just things unto themselves. And here, these lights, which we're going to see are the stars, the sun, and the moon, and so on, they aren't necessarily responsible for the light or the absence of light, but rather they govern the day and the night. And so they serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. More important than their existence materially is their function here. They have a purpose. And we mentioned this in the last session as well. When Genesis chapter 1 talks about making something or God creating something, it's far less about the material origins of something as we might think about it, as it's, atoms and things aligning to create a physical thing. And it's more about its purpose, its function, its reason for existing, or the job it does. That's what gives it its existence, is a function. And here, these greater lights in the expanse of the sky, they have a function, and that's why they exist. Some things to point out if we're going to compare the Genesis story to stories in the ancient Near East, and specifically how they viewed the sun, moon, and stars. In the ancient Near East, we have to remember that the heavenly bodies were the manifestations of the gods. They did not see the sun, the moon, or the stars as inanimate balls of matter or gas or whatever. In fact, they didn't even understand them to be like in space. Remember, the Earth is covered over a solid dome-like structure in their cosmology, and so the sun, moon, and stars actually were inside of the dome, and they would move across sort of the arc of the dome as manifestations of the gods and their job. For example, in the Akkadian pantheon, the goddess or the god Sin, or Shin, however you might pronounce it, he was given his place as the ruler of the evening sky by the chief god Marduk. And so when the moon moved across the sky, that was Sin overlooking and surveying his dominion or doing his job. And we read about that in the story Enuma Elish, chapter 5, verse 12 through 18. And so that's kind of how ancient people understood the sun, moon, and stars in general. So you can start to understand how people would worship these things. You can start to understand how people might look to the stars as a way of having divine messages or as divine signs, because they are synonymous with the gods themselves. Genesis has a very different picture of the sun, moon, and stars. It depicts them as inanimate things that the Lord Yahweh created and that he gave a job. And their job is to govern the day and the night, but their job is not to elicit worship or to rule over with any sort of dominion. They serve as signs. Excuse me. And that begs the question, well, signs for who? And again, that has yet to be answered. You can probably guess. It's certainly not for dogs, cats, or monkeys, but they serve as signs for someone, and that function makes them good. And so there's a little difference, even though they understood the sun, moon, and stars to function in a similar way. There's a very different understanding of what they are in the Genesis story. So again, we're sort of demythologizing the ancient world. We keep reading about that creation day. It says in verse 16, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars, and God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So we specifically here, earlier it says he just in general made great lights, but here it says he made the greater light and the lesser light. And that always struck me as odd. Like, we know what he's talking about. He made the sun and the moon. And then it says he also made the stars. So there's no question here what's being made. But why are they called the greater light and the lesser light? And that may be a detail that maybe you've noticed before. Maybe you've just read across it because, we've read this story 100,000 times and we know what he's talking about, so we just move on. But when we start to slow down and look at this story, this odd wording becomes a point of curiosity and further illustrates the sophistication of this story. So, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. We had mentioned before that the Hebrew language that Genesis 1 is written in, originally in its most ancient forms, is a consonantal language. That means that there were no vowels and there were no vowel markers initially. There was just consonants. And then, how you read the word really was dictated by the tradition that you were familiar with. An example of consonantal language, if you're looking at the screen, we've got here English figures C and T. All right, so that would be our word, CT. Now, there's a lot of different words you can make with CT. Some examples here, you can make the word cat. You can make the word coat. You can make the word cut. You can make the word cute. So there are several different words that we can make here, all with different vowels that are highlighted in red. And so unless you know how the story goes or how the reading is supposed to go, you could easily see where CT shows up, and we might be kind of confused, like, how am I supposed to read that? Well, if we were to look at the Hebrew language and we were to look at the creation story, we could have a very similar phenomenon. For example, the Hebrew people, they had a word for sun. It was shemesh, and that's written here. It's represented by the consonantal figures shin, mem, shin. And in Hebrew, we read from right to left. So shin, mem, shin. And you just understood that it's shemesh when you see that word in the Genesis, if you were to see that word in the context of a story. But the Akkadian language, or the Akkadian sun god, was named Shamash. Different vowels, but if you were to write that in Hebrew, it is shin, mem, shen. It's consonantally identical, but you just would read it differently according to the tradition. So the question then becomes, what happens if somebody is reading this creation story and they read that God created Shemesh, but they're not familiar with the story and they read Shamash? That introduces a lot of complication. And honestly, it would be very tempting to read it that way, because in all of these other ancient creation stories from other cultures, it's not inanimate matter that's being created. It is a chief god designating the function or the role of a lesser god. Remember, the sun, moon, and stars were the manifestations of divinity. And so it would be very tempting, and depending on who you were, maybe even natural, to read that Yahweh the Lord created Shamash, the sun god. And that completely undermines the main message of Genesis, that there's only one God that created everything, that creation is not a manifestation of a pantheon, that there are not other idolatrous gods to worship. And so you can start to see where there'd be a lot of potential confusion here. And so as a way of alleviating that and avoiding it entirely, in the inspiration of the Spirit and the genius of the author, we don't read that the Lord created the sun. We read that he created the greater light. And we know that what that is, but we avoid any potential idolatrous misconceptions. The same thing holds true when it comes to the moon. The Hebrew language has a word for moon. It's yarech. It's yod, resh, chet is the language, and yarech is how you read that. Well, in Ugarit, the moon god was named Yarach. All right, so same consonants, again, just different vowels. And if you don't have vowel markers and all you have is this ancient consonantal language, you run the same risk as with Shemesh or Shamash. Somebody could be reading this and read that Yahweh, the God of Israel, created Yarach, the moon god. Well, that's not what the story is saying, and it undermines the essential message of the story, that there is only one God and that creation is a thing, not a divine stage on which a pantheon of other idolatrous gods operate and function. And so again, to just avoid that idolatrous misconception, we don't read that Yahweh created the moon, Yarech. We read that he created the lesser light. And so this is really part of the sophistication of this story, and I think is a detail that just highlights how significant the ancient anti-idolatry message is, how essential that message is to the creation story. And that's why I stated and would argue in an earlier session, when we read Genesis 1, we're not really reading a story so much concerned about where the world came from or the material origins of the world. We're reading a story about how the world really works, who's really in charge of it, what is it, what does it do, why does it exist. That was the framework that these ancient cultures were more concerned about, because they had to deal with it more immediately. Why does the world work the way that it does? if we lived in an ancient pagan society or an ancient Near Eastern society that had a pantheon of other gods, we would look at creation and we would look at the sun and think, I have to live my life in a way that pleases the sun. I have to make certain offerings to the sun. I have to fulfill certain obligations and roles so that the sun will shine on my crops and my kids don't die. You lived your life in fear and subjugation to these gods, whereas Genesis gives a very different depiction of creation. Not one we have to be afraid of, but rather one that's created and almost tuned for humanity's benefit. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but that's the huge difference that we start to see here in details like this. If we keep going to the next creation day, in verse 20, we read, "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. And so God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day." So we read about the filling of the skies and the seas here. There's a refrain, according to its kind, that started with the third day, with the land that produced vegetation. The vegetation reproduced according to its kind. Here we see that birds and fish reproduce according to their kind. And so there is an order to the way that life propagates and continues. Dogs are not going to give birth to tigers. Corn is not going to, a stalk of corn is not going to yield watermelons. It's predictable, it's understandable, and therefore, because it's ordered, it is useful. Now, there's another one of these ancient details in this passage that once we see it, it really kind of reinforces this is an ancient story stemming from an ancient understanding of the universe. And it has to do with the great creatures of the deep. So in Hebrew, the word is tenin, or the plural is tenanim. In Ugarit, they had another word, tenin, and the tenin, which is actually featured right over here on this side of the screen, was an ancient serpent creature. I'm unclear if it was a sea serpent necessarily, but it was an ancient serpent creature. It's very similar to, there's a picture over here on the left side of the screen. This is a relief taken from a stele, which is kind of like just a placard, basically, from Hazor, which is near Phoenicia. It's sort of the north, if I believe, is sort of the northwestern or northeastern part of what we call Israel, near Phoenicia. And it depicts this hero slaying this serpent with 7 heads. And so seems to be, specifically the serpent with 7 heads, seems to be kind of a common mythological creature that was present in the nation of Israel. You can see some of the other iconography from this relief. There's an ankh, synonymous with Egypt. There's a scarab beetle, also synonymous with Egypt. And so there's this mythology about this 7-headed great serpent that seems to have run throughout this region. But great serpents, and particularly sea serpents, ran beyond Israel and Egypt. In the top left here, here's a picture we've used before in the presentation. This is an ancient relief depicting Marduk and his conquest of Tiamat. Tiamat, if you remember that myth, was this ancient primordial sea serpent who represented chaos, and she was a direct challenge to the gods. She threatened them. And it's only because Marduk slew her and was victorious that the gods were able to persist. And from Tiamat's corpse, Marduk ripped her in half, and from part of her sea serpent corpse, he created this waters above, and from the other half, he created the waters below. And so it's essential to the creation myth. We have 2 other pictures here, and these are a little later. These are taken from ancient Greece. And so they're several centuries after this, but they still illustrate that in these ancient cultures, sea serpents were very prevalent in the mythology. And you'll have to forgive me, I forget the stories that these are depicting, but they are based off of Greek myths. And so this idea of sea serpents, or great, monstrous beasts, the great creatures, the NIV calls it, the tenanim, It just runs throughout all of these ancient cultures. Other places in the Bible talk about these great creatures. In the book of Job, which is also an incredibly old, and some people would argue it's even older in some ways, or at least the content is older, or about the same time as the early stories in Genesis. Um, Very, very old book. But anyway, in Job, we read about a few creatures. Leviathan is one of them. And I forget the name of the other one, but there's another great creature that's mentioned in there. These monstrous creatures, and sometimes people would argue, well, that's referencing crocodiles or it's referencing hippopotamus. If you subscribe to a very, very literal understanding of the creation story, some people would say, well, he's talking about dinosaurs and people lived alongside dinosaurs. I think a far more likely explanation for those is right here in the ancient Near Eastern context. People believed in sea serpents. They believed in these great creatures of the deep. We get another reference to them in the prophet Isaiah. I believe it's Isaiah. He makes a reference to Rahab. Rahab is this great monstrous beast of the sea, and is maybe sort of a reflection of the Tiamat myth. But what's interesting is that in all of these depictions of these ancient monstrous creatures, whether it be Job or Isaiah or specifically here in Genesis, these are not threats to God. These are not creatures that challenge his authority or divinity. In fact, they're depicted as just being part of creation. God put them there. So not only is he have mastery over them, not only is he responsible for them, they bow before him and they serve this purpose that he looks at and says, that's good. I put them there for a reason. It's a very different message. Whereas if we were to look at the Tiamat story specifically, where Tiamat threatens the god, they're afraid. There's a real cosmic primordial struggle of who will win. That's not even a question in Genesis. The Lord made it. Of course he wins. And these creatures serve him. And so it's just this picture of creation that emphasizes the absolute unchallenged sovereignty of Yahweh, but at the same time kind of paints a much safer, less terrifying picture of creation. Yes, these Tananim, they're huge, they're monstrous, but they're still part of God's created world that he calls good. So it's just a very different take on the world. And if we were ancient people who lived in these societies, and specifically if we were traders or fishermen or sailors of some kind, who oftentimes were terrified by these myths of the great sea serpents of the deep, we would hear these and have a very different view of them. We would have reason for confidence. We would have reason not to fear the sea. I mean, you're still going to be afraid of like storms and stuff, but we wouldn't fear these great monsters because we know the Lord made them, that he is sovereign, and that they serve him even. So again, just sort of making the world a less terrifying place for ancient people. And that brings us to the sixth creation day, which we're not going to cover the whole thing. We're going to save the part about humanity for a separate conversation. But in verse 24, we read this. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And so it was so. And God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures, the creepy crawlies that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And so we see here the creation of land creatures, everything from the livestock to the lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, to the creepy crawlies on the ground, and all of them multiply according to their kind. I don't want to get ahead of myself too much because I guess I should follow the slides. So with the conclusion of this portion of day 6, the forming days have been addressed. Everything is formed, and now everything is filled. And the problems of formless and empty have been solved. And so God has not just given shape, but he has given purpose and function to this world. We read that life multiplies according to its kind. Again, the world is ordered and predictable, which is really, really good in light of a command that God is going to give to mankind to go forth, rule, and subdue, and to use this ordered world for their benefit. And we read that creation is good. It functions accordingly. If you remember from a previous lecture, the Hebrew word tov does not refer to any sort of perfection, but rather a completion or a purpose, a pleasing nature to it. Creation does what it's supposed to do. But what is that exactly? That hasn't been answered. We get all of these hints and these clues that everything is tuned for the benefit of somebody. There's days and seasons marked for somebody. There are plants and animals that reproduce accordingly for somebody. We don't know who yet, but I mean, if you know the story, you know it's for mankind. And that's what the next session is going to be about. We're going to talk specifically about the origin of man, the divine origin of man, and what that has to say about people and our purpose. Couple of reflections to take away from this part of the story. One of the main themes, as we've said many, many times, is that creation is not God. The ancient people lived in a highly mythologized world, meaning that divinity was responsible for everything. And here in Genesis, we see that is not the case, or at least it's not like there is some God who is responsible for sending the rain or some God who moves the sun across the sky. God creates the world to function on its own without some sort of ghost in the machine. It functions because he tells it to function. It's not a divine being. It's just an inanimate thing, which is a very different way of seeing the world compared to these other civilizations. We also see a main theme here, particularly in the filling days, is that creation is not something to be feared. It's good. Even the terrifying sea serpents and monsters of the deep are still subservient to God. He is absolutely sovereign over this world. So when you look at creation, you don't need to worry about keeping some capricious God happy. You simply need to honor the Lord and then go make the most of the life and the world around you that he's given you. And then finally, as we alluded to, creation has been tuned for the benefit of humanity, which is a very different message, as we're going to see in the next session, than what ancient people and other cultures were led to believe. Creation was for the gods. Humanity was for the gods. Humanity really was subservient to the divine. They were created in many instances just to make the gods' life easier. It's a very different picture, a far more loving and dignifying picture that we've already gotten in the story thus far, and we're really going to see that prove to be true exponentially so in the next session. So that's all we have for this morning. Or sorry, not this morning. It's morning while I'm recording. That's all we have for today. We hope that you got something out of this. I've had a lot of comments, some questions from people who have stuck with us and been through the last few episodes. And so probably when we wrap this up in another session or two, I'll just try to address some of those questions and then also try to put together some resources that have been super helpful for me in this, because I know there's been a lot of questions and sometimes confusion about this ancient world. And so I'll try to get all that put together. If you have any questions or you have suggestions or so on, don't hesitate to reach out. You can email us. You can, sometimes we do get the comments if you watch us on YouTube, but you can certainly drop me an email, call the church or something. I'd be happy to try to incorporate those as best we can. So that's all we have for today. Blessings, and we'll catch you next session. Bye.